So we were talking about modernization theory and facts. Christina, if you could just mute. Thank you. So we're talking about modernization theory and facts. We were just about to get into it, so that's fine because the other video. Modernization theory is just a process by which we talk about how we develop economically and how that causes, in a structural sense, causes it to be less likely that a dictatorship will stay in power, but also gives us more survivability to the democratic regime that takes over. Now, here's the important part, is modernization says some things about transition, about how regimes collapse. But so did Scotchpole, so did so many others about why do regimes collapse, right? The Levitsky and Way text talked a lot about why regimes collapse and why they don't. What's important to modernization theory, the strongest part about modernization theory, the biggest part about modernization theory is that we are unlikely to see really economically developed democracies collapse back into autocratic rule or dictatorship, right? And so we'll talk about this. Now, this has changed a little bit, but for the most part, if you're fairly economically developed and you become a democracy, you're going to stay a democracy, right? And they don't really explain that too much in this article. They give some details to it, but we'll talk about the math behind it, right? And I don't mean complex math, sort of very simple math about sharing versus having it all, right? So let's start with, right, their political regime. Now, they're going to say dictatorship. This is sort of a transitional aspect, right? Before the 20th century, we say dictatorship a lot, but we realize that dictators don't ever rule alone, right? They need backers, they need elites, right? We've talked about this a lot, right? They need some support from some group to govern because they can't do it, but one person can't govern a whole state, right? You need a coercive apparatus, you need funding, you need all of these things. And so the way that this path works is that as people sort of develop, right, the simplest argument is that they start to need organization, right? And we actually mentioned this before, right? In the 20th century, if you were in a factory, everyone has their own small job. But if your job is just to say, we're gonna use an automobile factory as an example. If your job is just to make the glass that goes in the car, you don't know necessarily how the rest of the car comes together. Right? You don't know how to put the tires on. You don't know how to put the doors on. I'm using very simple terminology. I don't want that to be the issue. So you need someone to say, okay, well, first we need to put the doors on, and then the tires. Tires are last because they're at the end of the line, right? And then once we put the doors in, then we'll put the glass in, right? So we don't break the glass as we're putting in. Or we need to put the glass in the doors first and then put the doors in, right? Whatever's most efficient, you need someone to coordinate that, to organize that. And so each individual is getting a complex task and getting more specialized in that task, right? And it starts being things like, I'm the only welder, right? Or I'm the only one who knows how to, right, set up this machinery. Or I'm the individual that knows how to design an automation line, right? And you get more and more specialty and less basic labor, right? Unskilled labor is the language that we use, right? The term that we use. And so when you see this cooperation and these complex tasks, right, then you start to get organized. And what happens is the workers who are organized and doing these things are separate from the government, and so they start having private information, right? This is why unions were so strong in the 20th century. And it's because, yes, you would initially go to talk about your job, right? We're in the welders union, or we're in the drivers union, or the service union, or whatever the union might be. And you start by talking about the things that you need for your work, right? We need protections, we need safety standards, we need equipment, right? We need a raise, whatever it is. But then you also start talking about other things in your life, and that's all private information. And you go through this process of sharing private information, and you start to develop a civil society, right? You don't just talk about what you need, you talk about issues with the government, you talk about issues with other people, right? Civil society can be a lot of things, but it has to start with people engaging and developing those connections and those networks. And then what happens is that civil society starts to make demands for reform. And when a civil society makes a demand for reforms, there's only two real outcomes. There are some very violent outcomes, but violent outcomes why they end lives don't end that civil society, right? That they don't kill that movement. Now, movements can fall apart for a whole host of reasons, but you can't really kill a movement, right? Because people respond very differently, right? If you attack the leaders of an opposition group, that gets a lot of people behind that opposition group, right? Why it's very callous, right? When you kill one person, right, in a group and it's not justified, what you end up is more people in that group, right? That you can't kill your way out of a movement, right? That's not a functional aspect. And so eventually there become two options for a dictator. Either the suppression gets so bad, right, that he is able to sort of stop that movement, but the outcomes that we're going to be talking about, one is that you start enacting reform, right? That you're like, okay, I get that you want certain things. You want safety standards. You want to say, right? So I'm still going to be in power. I'm still going to be the dictator, but you can have a legislative branch. You can make your own laws about the industry, because I don't really care how you run the automobile manufacturing industry. As long as you're making money and I can put that into my coffers, sure, you can run it however you want. So reform to allow you to do that on your own. And you want some sort of basic protections, or you want some sort of safety net. Fine, right? If that means that you're going to continue going to work and making money and helping the state grow its sort of economic power, right, then I will reform that. But those reforms, right, we talk about historically, right, England sort of reforming with the elites and losing more and more power and becoming more democratic because they had to make deals and contract theory, right? That's just another way to democratize. It's a slower way to democratize, but it's a little more peaceful, and it can happen step by step so people are prepared. And what we see is that it happens in slow step, and then elections and democracy, and then full democracy, right? Really full democracy with civil liberties and all that. If that happens along a path, what you end up with is a very strong democracy because the citizens have adopted each step of the path. The other way is that the dictator is out, right? Forced out violently, physically, or because they abdicate, whatever reason, right? Then a new system comes into place. And we know from the Levitsky way, just because you have a new regime coming into place, a new system or a new government coming into place, right? Whatever changes happen, that doesn't mean it's democratic. It's possible to be democratic. And this is one of the things that people sort of miss about modernization, right? That modernization will lead to this likelihood that you're going to transition. But very few arguments are deterministic. Very few arguments say this is the way it's going to be. Sorry, if you're watching, oh, okay. I forgot to start the recording, so that's going to be a little off. But I was still on the first slide, so we're fine. Okay, there we go. Okay, I hate this. All right, so we're in that first part. So now let's look at the actual causal chain. And this causal chain is the thing that I really want you to get. This is the thing that you're most likely to be tested on. These are the things that we're going to have questions about. There is a quiz up, so you'll see this come up. I want you to prepare for these questions, so you'll see them multiple times. And the chain works in a very specific order. First, you have industrialization. So a wealthy elite builds a factory. And that factory has 40 different jobs. And all those jobs need to be done very efficiently, very quickly, right? And while the factory owner isn't worried about the safety of the individual, they know that if someone gets hurt or if someone's injured, that it's going to slow down the process, right? Not in a moral sense. I don't want these people to get hurt. But if I have someone put their arm in the machine and it gets caught, everyone's going to stop, the machine's going to stop, I'm going to lose so much money in that process. So they want people who can operate those machines without getting hurt. They want people who can do that very quickly and still produce the same quality of product, whatever that quality level is, they want it to stay the same, right? And so they build these factories and they start training people at very, very specific tasks, right? You only do step one, the next guy does step two, the next woman does step 4, right? And you continue along that path, and where each one of you has a different task and a different specialization. Well, if I build a factory and I say I need 10,000 people, or in the beginning of the 20th century, 200 people, well, that's essentially 200 families, right? That's 200 families that are going to leave the rural area, that are going to leave the farmlands, that are going to leave, right, in a worse condition, and they're going to come to a city center so that they can work in these factories. And so industrialization happens before urbanization, right? Now you have some cities that pop up for other reasons, right? Like New York is a port city, San Francisco is a port city, so they get this concentration of cities that naturally occur before industrialization. But most cities occur in the first stage because of industrialization. And so then you have urbanization. You have people moving to these city centers, looking for work, getting these skilled tasks. And so this happens in a chronological order. First industrialization and then urbanization. So you get all these people, and now you have all these people in a city in a concentrated area, and you start to realize that while your employees are good, your employees don't have the skill set to be highly effective at their jobs. They're unskilled labor. And so you're training them up, but it's expensive to train them, right? It's expensive to train new employees. It takes time, and you need some employees who really understand the inner workings of the machinery. You need mechanics, right? You need that automation engineer. You need these people who can make your factory more efficient. And so what you start to realize is you need people that are educated. And I mean college educated, right? You need specialized educations like an engineer, like an accountant. You need attorneys, right? Because you're in business, or you're gonna have to do some court filings. You need all these people. You need salespeople, right? And salespeople are typically have a bachelor's degree, right? They have some communication or something like that. And so as we're progressing to the 20th century, education becomes this thing that factory owners need, that the people who get an education get a better job, and they're already in a city center, right, that doesn't provide a lot of services. So the government starts to see, okay, we need to provide education for children, but then universities pop up, right? And private colleges, for-profit colleges pop up, right? And you start to see all this happening because the people who are getting that education, they can make more money. And so education happens after urbanization because you need a certain amount of concentration to have a school, right? If you don't have enough concentration, it's very difficult to have any type of college because you need a lot of people to go to that school. And if you've ever been to what they call a classic college town, there's nothing around it and their attendance is very low. But in Las Vegas, there's millions of people around UNLV, and pandemic, right, is an exception. Next year, we're gonna have a very high attendance rate, right? We're gonna have a ton of students. We're gonna have thousands and thousands of students on this campus in August, September, depending on a lot of factors, right? We're not through the pandemic yet. We're getting close, right? But we still have to get through these last few months. And then we might still have masks and all of these other things. But at some point, right, we're gonna be in a classroom, thousands of us on campus. And so that education happens after urbanization is very important. Well, now you've got people in a close concentration, high density in a city. You've got them educated so they understand how things work. And because they're educated, they understand how the government works, how policies are working. And then you know that in order to get all of this to come together, right, this entire modernization chain, you need someone like a manager, middle manager, coordinator, team lead, whatever it is. They have to communicate all of the different tasks. You have to delegate tasks. You have to work with supervisors. You have to make sure that everyone's on the same page. And so now you have an educated workforce. You have in high concentration, and now they're communicating with each other. They're making groups. They're making unions, right? Sometimes they need to unionize because they, right, want to have higher wages. They start working through all of these coordination problems, and as they do that, they form groups. They start to right, organize for things other than just their jobs. They start to organize for their community, right? They start discussing policies so that the average citizen understands what policies exist and how they work, right? Whether it be bus schedules or, right, mass transit systems or, right, clean air and clean water, right? All of these things start to get discussed as part of the job coordination, right? If you need your employees to get to work, and we're talking early 20th century, and most of them can't afford a car, then one of the things that will happen is eventually they will, hold on one second. Eventually they will start to have groups that are political. And then you get mobilization, right? So you have to have civil society. You have to have, right, this communication, and then you can have mobilization. And mobilization is where you get them out of their houses and you get them into groups, right? Whether it be going to vote, right? You get them out to vote. And if you're not in a society that can vote, it's about going and marching in the street, right? Getting outside and saying, we want something different. We want to demand some changes, and these changes are going to make our lives better, right? And so through that process, what eventually happens, we talked about this in Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? You've got a job, you've got a place to live, you've got an education, your children are getting an education, you're communicating in groups because you want that personal network. And now what do you want? Now you want self-connected outcomes, right? And so you want political incorporation. I want a vote and a say, and that leads us to a representative government, right? And representative government is sort of the first aspect of a democracy, right? And so there's a clear causal chain starting with industrialization, leading all the way to essentially a democratization, right? Political incorporation is the first part where you get a say and you can elect officials and things like that. And then eventually you get to a democracy, right? All 7 criteria, right? Checks and balances, right? You know, responsible parties, rule of law, all of those things come together as you go through this modernization chain. So there are other ways that a democracy collapsed. Obviously, there are other ways that a democracy collapsed, right? The one is the death of a founding dictator. So there are some leaders who, when they were dying, it seemed like the entire regime could collapse. After the 1979 Iranian Revolution, the Ayatollah Khomeini, he had different people in line for his death. He was already quite old when he rose to power in '79. But one of the things that we saw was that he had led through personal rule. In fact, most dictators have these personal networks. We talked about this, right? Incumbents have this personal network, and then the clients do the violence. The clients who are getting the benefits, who have the access to resources, they're the ones who go out and engage in all this activity to keep the elites in power, right? The people who are benefiting are the one acting, not the incumbent. The incumbent's just the people in government, right? And so when you have that issue, right, and it's all connected to your personal network, right? Are you connected to Castro in Cuba? Are you connected to Khomeini in Iran, right? Right? Whenever are you attached to Putin in Russia, right? And so each of these elites that have this power, the resources, are getting that power through a personal connection to the dictator. So if the dictator were to die, then you could have a regime collapse. But we know that, right? That's not really connected to modernization. Yes, if the dictator has a regime collapse, but sometimes it doesn't, right? Sometimes they continue on. Khomeini dies, and Khamenei, right, who's the current Ayatollah, right? He sort of just takes over, and it's not really clear if his name was just close enough because language and barriers, or that he knew, right? Khomeini, as he was, I knew that Khamenei would keep the same institutions as his predecessor, right? And so when you have that, yes, there's a transition, but that's sort of always going to happen when you have a leader die, right? Transitions are very difficult, right? We talked about this in Levitsky way. Succession, when one person leaves office for death or injury or old age or whatever reason, it's very difficult to get someone new in because those connections are there, that trust isn't there. The next part is an economic crisis, and we talked about this a bit as well. If you have an economic downturn, and you can no longer pay out your patrons, that you can no longer provide resources to your clients, you're going to lose support. And when you lose support, you can have revolution, right? We talked about this in Scotchpole's piece, right? That economic downturns or a military loss, or anytime you have a crisis, right? An external shock, what we call an external shock, right? Something bad happens to your state, and your state, your government, right? Your regime needs to handle it. If you can't, right? If you're the leader, the dictator, and you can't respond to a natural disaster, you can't respond to a recession in your state, you can't respond, right, to a foreign enemy, then it's very difficult for you to remain in power. These things are all true, but they don't really change the way that modernization is impacting, right? Because you always have an external crisis. Natural disasters hit all states at some point. All leaders eventually die, and we're going to have recessions, right? So these are sort of universals, but they don't really change how modernization works. They just take other factors that matter. And what Shorsky and Neto point out is that, yeah, these things happen, right? These things happen, but they're sort of temporary. The long-term impact of why we're seeing so many democracies is because as they modernize, they're more likely to transition, slightly more likely to transition, but they're much more likely to stay a democracy if they're a highly modernized society. And then lastly, foreign pressure, right? Saddam Hussein, he's not technically a dictator, but very clearly an authoritarian government. But in 2003, the United States removed him from power, right? They occupied the entire state of Iraq, right? Quite quickly occupied the state of Iraq, right? So you can have foreign pressure, or you could just have this foreign power just take down your regime, right? During the Cold War, Vietnam, Korea, right? Just split in half and new regimes put into place, right? And so foreign pressure really has an impact, but we've talked about that in another context, and that's more of an IR point. But domestically, you always have foreign pressure, and these weak states are always under foreign pressure. So it's not like any of these are unique explanations. They're sort of universals. They're all over the place. And if they were really driving something, we'd see more alignment in who is a democracy, right? We would see more of that. And so Levitsky and Wade do say if you have a connection to the West, they're going to push you towards democratization. But that's not a domestic force, that's a sort of external force, right? An external aspect. And so they make that difference between exogenous means on the outside, right? Or an external factor. So foreign pressure is an external factor. What they're pointing out is that modernization and democracy, these are endogenous, they go together, right? They pressure each other, right? Your economic development starts to happen, you modernize, and so calls for democratization come in. And democratization pushes modernization, and they're connected and they're working together, right? And so you can't really set up a clear causal chain for a regression analysis because what's coming first, the democratization or the modernization, but you can see they're working together towards sort of meeting at a singular goal. That's their argument, right? Whether you accept it or not isn't really, that's not the issue. So we did talk about this. The first part is this likelihood of transition versus survival. Now, they make this point that as you get, and it's sort of a U-shaped, an inverse U-shaped path, as you get more and more income, dictatorships become frailer, right? They become more likely to fail. Until about 4,000. And 4,000 is per capita income, so it would mean that the average person, right, the average income for the person, not the average person, but the average income for each person is around $4,000 a year, which is low, but right, remember cost of living and things this is constant dollars, right? So across all economies, about $4,000, right? Adjusting for all of those other factors, right? That they would hit this point where they would say, no, we have all of the things modernization, right? We're organized, we're specialized, we're educated, we're urban, right? We want to transition. And it is influenced by these external factors. The external factors we talked, the alternative explanations. They all influence. But after about 4,000, if you have higher income, right? If you're a dictatorship and your per capita income is 8,000, then you're more likely to survive. Now, why is that? Because at some point, if you're a dictator and you're paying your people a high amount of money, they're getting a lot of money through the government that you're setting up, they don't want to, right? You can buy off certain groups, right? These groups say, we want, better living conditions, or we want a legislative branch, and you're like, well, I can't really give you representative government, but I'm going to change your wages from $10 to $20. And they say, okay, well, we'll pay for our own infrastructure then. We'll take care of everything, you can stay in power, but now we have enough money to live the life we want. And then a dictatorship actually gets more resilient because those people are making so much money. Now, it makes them more vulnerable to an economic crisis because they're paying them a high amount for their work. But as long as they don't hit a recession or a depression and they can afford to continue that, and if they have a lot of oil rents, right, a lot of a resource wealth where they're selling oil and getting those rents so they can afford to pay a higher wage, then they don't have to have a representative government, right? Look at Saudi Arabia. They still have a monarchy. They have a crown prince, right? Well, why are those families and the people, well, one, the people that are not part of the Saudi family, they're not citizens of the state because of the rules that they have. But also, why is the Saudi family not sort of forcing the shift? Because they're all very, very wealthy, and they don't want to upset a system where they have a lot of wealth. So at some point, dictatorships start to become more resilient at high income levels. Now, the next part is survival. Now, they talk a lot about what it is to survive as a democracy, but the point that I think makes this most clear is that their evidence is very strong, because if you were a democracy and your per capita income was over 6,000, approximately 6,000, there was no collapse, right? No state, right, in the time frame that they looked at, because obviously there were some transitions, there's some issues moving forward, but essentially, once you get to a certain level of modernization, income, and democracy, you don't see it collapse. You see it lock in, right? Once you set up a democracy and have enough income, there's no backsliding into authoritarian regimes. There's no dictators coming about, right? And so you see their argument is, yeah, modernization helps with transition, but the really important note to make is that survival is practically guaranteed if you reach a high enough per capita income, right? That this is determinism that they're talking about, right? If you have over 6,000 in per capita income adjusted for constant dollars, so right, accounting for inflation and things like that, and you're a democracy, you're more than likely going to stay a democracy. And so we want to make sure that we're looking into that as well. Okay. Okay, so now let's talk about this. Actually, we did talk about this, right? Oh, no, okay. So why, if you're wealthy, would a democracy survive? If you're a dictatorship, right, if you try and form a dictatorship, one of the things that's going to happen is that you're going to have to damage economic systems, right? Think about it in the simplest way. If you want to take power, one of the things you're going to have to do is burn down a factory or destroy a building or have a war, right? A war is very damaging to your economy, right? If you're actually in the state that the war is happening, right? The United States has this sort of war economy that works, but there's no fighting on American soil. There's no state to state, interstate fighting on American soil. Right? There's obviously violence and other factors, but as far as states going to war, the wars don't actually occur on American soil, right? They're sort of outside of that grounds. If you're in a war on your own territory, right, your buildings are going to be destroyed, your factories, your communication networks are going to be damaged because you're not coordinating between groups. And so there's this cost associated with gaining power, right? When you have to pay that cost, right, you're going to get, if you win, if you become a dictator, you get all of the wealth, right? You don't have to share it with the opposition, but you get less than the total that existed before you became a dictator. Now, if you share the wealth, but it's a higher total wealth, then you're sharing a portion of a larger piece, right? And so this becomes this very, very simple math. If the entire economy is $10, but it would cost you $7, right? Because conflict really damages an economy. So it costs you $7 in damages to take over, then your share as a dictator is $3. If you are sharing between an opposition, and let's just say it's 50-50. It's unlikely it would be 50-50, but let's just say that it's split between you and an opposition group. Then you're getting $5. So your share in a democratic system is larger than having everything in a dictatorship. And eventually an economy would recover, but in the short term, at least the next 5 to 10 years, because it takes a long time to recover from a conflict, the party, the incumbent and the opposition are getting more from sharing than they would from getting everything, right? And so there's no reason for any one group to try and push for a democratic or an authoritarian dictatorship or an authoritarian regime. It makes more sense economically to share the revenues that the state has between the political parties, right? As long as each group's share, or the largest group, the group that can become a dictatorship, as long as their share is larger than the dictatorship whole, right? And so this logically is very simple, but it makes a lot of sense. And because conflict is so expensive, both in political costs and economic costs and the lives of those who fight it, right? You lose so much economic power in a conflict that it may not even be worth it to become a dictator. Now, that's a logical argument. Obviously, there's an emotional argument, right? People want to be in charge, and they don't really care how they get in charge, right? But what we've seen is most leaders who are authoritarian in their beliefs are still willing to do what is logical in order to maintain their power and wealth, right? That the most sort of staunch Democrat who believes in high taxes still wants to maintain their wealth if they're a millionaire, right? And so you see a lot of Democrats moving to Texas and Nevada where they don't have state income tax, right? Even though they support higher taxes and higher services. They're still evading that by moving to a state without income taxes. And evades maybe the wrong word, right? But they're still avoiding that by moving to a state without income tax, with a state income tax. All right. So the next issue with modernization is this idea of when you're vulnerable. And so modernization theory takes the import substitution model of modernization, of economic development. And so in the early stage, you need all these factories and this specialization, right? You have economic growth, right? People are getting jobs and they're getting paid real money for those jobs. They're going to work every day, right? They're bringing that money home and they can help their families, right? And so everyone starts coordinating. They start following that causal chain we already discussed. In that first part, of course you're going to have a better chance of democratization, right? Everyone likes the system. We're getting paid more. We're having better lives. We're starting to have an education, working together, and everything is sort of improving at that first stage. How could it not, right? You're going from a loose agrarian society to a highly productive society, right? And so, of course, people are going to want to democratize. So this very clearly improves the chances of democratization. But then you have to go to the next step. And they're talking about import substitution. And we'll talk about that. We've talked about import substitution before. Remember, this is the South Korea model. So South Korea started with textiles. They're doing really well. Then they develop a, automobile industry, and that helps them become sort of an economic powerhouse. Well, the problem is you're exporting these low value added goods, right? Textiles are low value added. And we'll talk about that language in a little bit. You start selling these goods to other states at a low cost. You have labor suppression. You're keeping the cost of textiles low so that you can sell them and take those resources and develop an automobile industry, a computer company, right? Whatever it is, right? Sony's company develops after World War II, right? In Japan, mostly out of the loose parts, cheap wages, right? And excess material that was available right after World War II, right? Started making stereos with all the metal and technology that was just left on the ground because of all the damage that was done, right? And all the waste that happened at the end of World War II. So that development was a very unique strategy, but there's no guarantee that it's going to work, right? Daewoo, the automobile industry Daewoo that South Korea made to develop, it doesn't exist, right? It's a smaller company, right? But it was absorbed by larger automobile companies, right? You can't buy a Daewoo car, right? You can't go out and buy a Daewoo car. That was a small time frame. And they were very successful, but that's not a guaranteed success. If your new high value added product was typewriters in the 1990s, you just spent all of that time to develop something that's going to be worthless, right? And so there's a lot of risk involved in what we call the intermediate stage, right? And so this can have a really problematic point. This can create a really problematic point, and that you're doing really well in the early stages, but then when we try and transition to the next stage, it can go really poorly. And if it does go poorly, then it's going to lower the chances of democratization, because you're going to have authoritarian leaders saying, look, this is a broken system. You should let me step in and take over. You don't need all this organization. You don't need this communication. You don't need to mobilize because it's not working, right? And so in the import substitution stage, you see a lot of vulnerability in the modernization argument, right? And then once you've gotten to that last stage where you're economically developed and you have a system that requires a lot of coordination, then if you are a democracy, if you sort of made it to that point where you're a democracy, then the economically developed state, it can hold up and survive and sort of hold up a democratic regime. And it can sustain a non-democratic regime, right? That once you're in that last stage, right, you're like, we're a developed society, we have lots of wealth, then the people in that society can go either way, right? If you don't transition before the last step, before you have full modernization, then if that dictator was able to survive, there's some reason why that dictator was able to survive, whether it's personal network or foreign support, or whatever it is, right, that both regimes, democratic and authoritarian, they're very survivable. They can be sustained for a long period of time. Mubarak in Egypt was in rule for decades, right? The democratic systems of the UK, the United States, France, right? They've been able to sustain, and all of those hold true because of their very highly developed, economically developed states. So we want to talk about, so we have this question, right? Okay, well, at the high economic development, some of them are not transitioning. So what's happening? And so here we have to talk about two different historical contexts. If you were independent before 1950, if you were the United States, France, China, Russia, right, Spain, England, right, all of those, if you were the sort of, what we're going to talk about later is the global north, that you were an established state before World War II, then you fall into this thing of waves, what they call waves. So the second wave, you have a lot of these democratizations, and then you have a reverse wave. So you have a lot of democratizations, and then a lot of those democracies collapse and return to an authoritarian government. And then you have a third wave at the end of, in the 70s, going up until about the Cold War, where you have all of these democratizations, but then you have sort of a collapse of these things. And so it's not a continuous increase. So it doesn't really support modernization theory, because if modernization theory works, and it was deterministic, it was a structural argument, not individual states, but this is how all states will develop, and as they economically develop, they will become democracies, then you should see a continuous increase. And you didn't see that in the older states, right? You see this back and forth, these waves going increases and decreases sort of all the time. What we do see in the states independent after 1950, right? The sub-Saharan African states who went from colonies to independence, to independent and autonomous states, right? Latin America, right, which sort of really formulates a lot of its statehood in the 20th century, right? So you had this, what we call global South, really becoming states in the 20th century after World War II, and they do see a continuous increase. So modernization theory may not hold for older states, but as far as states that were independent after 1950, right, this argument does seem to hold. So these newer states might have modernization tied into democratization in a way that didn't exist for older states, right? And we talked about this a lot, right? The history of France and England is not the history of Chile and Argentina or Latin American rivalries, right? That war state building that occurred between France and England is not the rivalry of Latin American states, right? So they're different cases, and it makes sense that modernization would really apply to the 20th century for states that came about after World War II, right? So yes, it only fits in these cases, but there are a lot of these cases, and there's a lot of explanation that can be gained from it. And then the last part is this argument that they make that you don't have to, like, it has some flaws, but it has a lot of critical analysis about understanding data. In 1950, you have all these states pop up, and only about 12 to 20% of them become democracies. But the total number of states increases dramatically, and very few of them are, about less than 1 in 5 is democracy. And so when you see the reverse wave, right, where you have more authoritarian regimes, that's not necessarily that older states reverted back to authoritarian regimes. It's this thing called dilution, right? That you have all of these states come in to the system that are authoritarian, and it makes it look like the total number of democracies has declined, the total percentage of democracies has declined. But yes, the percentages went down, but not the total number. The total number continued to increase. The total number of democracies to continue to increase over this time period, right, from 1940 to 2000. After 2000, we see that there are more democracies than other states we talked about, right? So if the most common type of regime is democracy, then it starts to permeate through diffusion, through international norms, that the standard becomes democracy, and if you're not a democracy, there's going to be international pressure for you to become a democracy, right? That's the Levitsky and White text, right, after the Cold War. Cold War ends, and there's all this international pressure because the norm is democracy. But that's not necessarily what's happening in modernization theory, right? Modernization theory says, yes, there are norms and there's external pressures, but all states are sort of industrializing. Eventually, all states will have an industrial network, a service economy, right? And because they're all headed in the same direction, right? This is that evolutionary deterministic argument, right, that we've talked about before, right? They're all improving their economic situation. They're all becoming more industrialized, more urban, more connected to technology and education. So they're all going to eventually want a democracy because they're going to need to coordinate, communicate, and that's going to lead to mobilization, right? And so this is a path-dependent argument. All right. The part that I want you to take away that is problematic is that we have a very clear, concerning conclusion. The conclusion that Tversky and Netto come to that they are getting at, right, really becomes this issue of the order of things. Because one of the things that they talk about is that in their theory, in modernization theory, every state starts as a dictatorship, right? Every state starts as a dictatorship, and then they sort of suppress labor, they sort of fight against organization, but modernization keeps pushing over the long period of time, and you start to get more organized and connected in civil society, and then you transition to a democracy, and if you're economically developed enough, you'll stay a democracy. Well, that's a problem because the argument seems to be saying that you have to start as a dictator with a dictatorship or an authoritarian regime. You have to have labor suppression, right? Look at South Korea. The argument is that it happened through labor suppression. Do we actually need labor suppression? And this creates this argument that is very problematic where you say everyone has to go through the hard time to get to be in a democracy, right? That if you just start a democracy, it's not as stable. Well, if we have to follow this causal chain, we have to follow this chronologically in order, and we have to industrialize and then urbanize and then go through all of the other steps, doesn't that mean that people aren't prepared to be a democracy at the beginning stages? And that's clearly not true, right? Many of the states that became states after World War II just started as a democracy, right? We happen to be one of those states, right? We started as a democracy. Now, we had a bunch of issues about what it meant to be democratic or universal suffrage, but while the standard of what is a democracy has changed over time, one of the things that we notice is a lot of states have started when they become independent of being very democratic. So they may not need that industrialization step before they can become a democracy. And as I talked about at the beginning of this, right, there's this other factor. That industrialization was a 20th century environment. We don't really need industrialization, right, at the same level. You still need urbanization, but one of the things that you can have to have a developed society is education that's sort of funded in some way, and then those jobs aren't connected to manufacturing, right? We are moving away from a manufacturing industrialized society into a service economy. And by services, I don't just mean waiters and people who work at grocery stores, and people who are directly serving you food, and accountants, and those things that are doing services directly for one person. I also mean computer scientists and engineers, right? This service where I'm going to come in and do something for you to support what you're doing. And as that size of the economy, the service economy grows, then industrialization is connected. But the service economy is just going to become another way to modernize. Right? You still have urbanization because they need to be somewhere where there's work, right? You still have communication because they need to be able to communicate what needs to be fixed with high communication, and that communication is going to lead to organization, right? How do we get those networks, right? Cell phone networks and towers and information systems, and how do you communicate, delegate, how do you protect that information becomes this new way of looking at modernization to say, yes, you don't need the factory, but the factory was sort of just how you got the specialization. And there's another reason, right? The service economy has high specialization, right? You want to live in a city because then you can sell your services to more people, right? Or to more groups, more companies, right? And then you're going to want that education and communication, and that's going to still lead to mobilization, right? So a service economy can work the same way as an industrialized manufacturing economy in the sense of modernization. Okay, so that is it for now. We're going to take a long break, it looks like. We're going to break until 10 o'clock. So we have a bit of time, about 28 minutes. I can easily get to the last part and we'll talk about the paper. But for now, go ahead and exit this. I'm going to post the two recordings, and then we will move on to dependency theory, and the extra credit, and then at the last part, we'll talk about the paper. So thank you. This will be the end of this section.